Shares of Cyberonics are soaring today following a recommendation from an FDA panel to approve the company's medical device for the treatment of depression.
Chronic depression affects more than 4 million Americans at a cost of about $80 billion a year. Company CEO Skip Cummins says Cyberonics is the market leader in this next medical frontier. He joins us now with more. Skip, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
What an interesting frontier it is. I mean, we visited with you a few months ago on the stock of the day to examine it.
But we got news today now, or news out of this FDA panel. What does it mean for the company?
Well, what it means for the company is neuromodulation is regarded as the next frontier for medical devices in this country. And certainly, if this leads to approval, which it appears as though it will enable Cyberonics to become the market leader in that next frontier for devices, the neuromodulation market.
Take a look at that screen. We just saw the device. I think it's now we're looking at actually some surgery, so maybe we won't get a closer look at it. But that disc-shaped unit that we saw there.
People are referring to it as a pacemaker for the brain.
Exactly. That's one way to think about it, because what it does is it applies mild pulsed electrical signals to the vagus nerve in the patient's neck, and then our mechanism of action research has shown that those pulsed electrical signals are efficiently transmitted into the brain and produce widespread and bilateral effects in the parts of the brain that are implicated in epilepsy and mood disorders such as depression.
So, what does this ruling yesterday mean? Where does it take you in the process with the FDA?
The final step before approval by the FDA is an advisory panel recommendation. The vote was 5-2 yesterday for approval with conditions, and the good news is that virtually all of the conditions that the panel asked for were part of our depression plan and are consistent with our epilepsy history.
So this is one of these panel decisions that we as journalists often say the FDA usually follows the recommendations of its panels. One doesn't know for sure, but that's the pattern.
That's correct, especially for products whose safety is very well established, which this product is, considering it's the same product that's used in epilepsy.
Let's talk a little bit about the numbers so our viewers know what we're talking about. You have been treating this for epilepsy, and there's a view that of your $100 million last year in epilepsy treatments, that could grow to about $500 million a year just on the epilepsy side. That's not dealing with the treatment-resistant depression.
Correct.
What's your addressable market in numbers?
Yeah, our epilepsy business is $110 million annual sales, profitable, cash flow positive business that's internally funded all our growth and development for the last 3 years. Now, the depression market opportunity by any measure is at least 10 times the size of the epilepsy market. In terms of number of treatment-resistant patients, 4 million in depression versus 425,000 in epilepsy, and in terms of the use of a device-like procedure. In depression, that's electroconvulsive therapy, where 100,000 patients are treated with ECT every year in the U.S. with depression. And in epilepsy, of course, that's vagus nerve stimulation and epilepsy surgery, where only 10,000 patients are treated. So if you multiply that 4 million patient market in the U.S. times the $15,000 price for our product, it's a $60 billion market franchise for Cyberonics if we get FDA approval.
All right, this is all great if nobody else comes up with something that takes a piece of that market. If you have the market to yourself, you have that sort of potential. What do you own here? What is it that your competitors can't try to develop, take away from you? What intellectual property do you have here that would keep those competitors out of the space?
Well, we have method patents, which give Cyberonics the exclusive right to manufacture or sell a product in the U.S. that applies a pulsed electrical signal, which means anywhere to 3 key cranial nerves, the vagus being the most important. So in essence, if a competitor would like to develop a cranial nerve stimulator and use the less invasive cranial nerve highway as opposed to drilling deep into the brain to stimulate the brain, they would have to, of course, come and talk to us due to our intellectual property.
You have about 120 employees in your sales and marketing division. You're going to increase with 60% of that. You're going to go up. If this is as big as it's going to be, shouldn't you be doing this with somebody else? You're talking big numbers here.
Well, there are approximately 6,125 psychiatrists that treat over 70% of the patients in this country who have treatment-resistant depression. And as we look at that marketplace, clearly to call on those psychiatrists in the beginning, we're going to need a total sales force to call on those psychiatrists plus 2,000 neurologists who are using our product in epilepsy of about 220 total people. Now that will be in the first 6 months of launch. When we see how receptive the market is, of course, then we can properly scale the sales force after that.
Skip, good to have you here today. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Skip Cummins, CEO of Cyberonics.
All right, coming up on Money Gang, interest rates on student loans are about to drop to historic lows.
We're gonna tell you how to make this work to your advantage when we come back.
Of surgery that's really making a lot of money for everyone involved. The reason
It's a great story. It's going to really help people with depression. We also have House Ways and Means Chairman Bill Thomas, who's going to tell us about a very important corporate tax cut. And there's trouble in Chicago.
Yes, at the Hollinger Enterprise, HLR, that could be my favorite today. Covad recommended this morning by some fellow on Squawk Box. Is it something you should buy, or is it something you should sell?
And after we get through taking that one down, we're going to talk about lots of new millionaires and lots of new wealth creation last year in the U.S., in China, in India, and worldwide. Don't you just love new millionaires?
That's by earnings too. We got to feel for that. Hey, how much do you put in one show works?
And a KMC chat cabinet on the market, please. Come right back.
Cyberonics right here.
We're ready to rock.
Bravo and Kramer. Stay with us.
Our job is not done. There's a lot of consumers out there, particularly minorities, that are still looking for their chance of owning.
Today, 15 points following FDA panel recommendation to approve an implantable device for treatment-resistant depression. Joining us now is Cyberonics Chairman and CEO Skip Cummins. Sir, big win. Let me understand. When a company doubles its market cap, I immediately want to say, is there something else going on here? Are there bulls who think that this thing's going to be used maybe by millions of people, or did someone just get caught short this stock? Because it seemed like yesterday things weren't going that well for you.
Well, you know, anytime you have a major binary event like an FDA advisory panel meeting, there are those who believe you're going to get panel recommendation for approval and those who believe it will be a non-approvable recommendation. So I think what you're seeing in the stock is a mix of a fair amount of both of that.
All right. I just want to say I think this is a terrific thing. Depression, mental illness is such a difficult thing. 4 million plus could be eligible. Just tell us, how is this going to work? You're moving this from epilepsy treatment to depression treatment, to implants, to the neck. Kind of walk me through that.
Right, well, it's the exact same device and therapy, same implant location and technique for both epilepsy and depression. And actually, we got the idea for depression from epilepsy. So yesterday's panel decision was very good news for 4 million patients today with treatment-resistant depression who currently have no FDA-approved, safe, effective, and tolerable long-term treatment for their terrible, lifelong, and life-threatening illness. But at the same time, it's good news for 425,000 Americans with pharmacoresistant epilepsy, who 50% of whom have comorbid or depression with their epilepsy. And today, they have no FDA-approved anticonvulsant that's also approved for their depression. So it's good news not only for people with depression, but also good news for epilepsy.
All right, Mr. Cummins, one of the things that's very clear is that the pharmaceutical industry did its very level best over the course of the last 5 years to do everything it could to destroy your company, in my view. Because they wanted pharma to be the only solution. You have a much more radical way to do it, but it's one for people who have no hope. Why shouldn't they let them have it? If you're seeing a psychiatrist right now and the guy is saying, listen, the resistant drugs are not working, should you tell him to go, can I try the Cyberonics? How's it going to work? Or is it only going to be used initially by people who, frankly, are incapable of making decisions because they are so bad off, and that's who's going to have the Cyberonics device?
Well, one of the things we've built in our epilepsy business is a unique demand creation model and organization to create awareness, acceptance, and demand for a revolutionary device-based therapy in a classic specialty pharmaceutical market. So in this case, it will be psychiatrists making the treatment decisions with their patients. So we will have educational programs, both for psychiatrists and for patients, and they'll together make the decision. Again, when you look at treatment-resistant depression, just like pharmacoresistant epilepsy, if you have a patient that's failed 4 to 5 adequate treatments, that patient's course of illness is pretty well defined, and that is they do have chronic or recurrent treatment-resistant depression. They need an effective and tolerable long-term or maintenance therapy. ECT is a very effective acute therapy. Medications are very effective acute therapies, but again, today, there is no FDA-approved, safe, effective, and tolerable long-term treatment for treatment-resistant depression. When you think about a chronic illness like depression, that's exactly what these patients need.
In terms of marketing this, commercializing it, marketing it, will the insurance companies and the HMOs and so forth, will they pay for this? Will they cover this?
One of the amazing things about our epilepsy experience, and we had 7 different customers to convince to adopt this therapy, is the payers were first. As a matter of fact, in 2004 in epilepsy, CMS, which controls Medicare hospital reimbursement, increased hospital outpatient reimbursement for VNS therapy by 23%. Now, when's the last time you heard of Medicare increasing reimbursement for anything? They did that because VNS is very cost effective. Similarly in depression, what we know about depression today is that patients that have attempted suicide once or been hospitalized once for their depression cost payers over $42,000 per year, most of which is hospitalization-related expenses. So this time around, we already have coding and reimbursement. All we need is coverage, and we're quite confident that within a year after approval, we will have virtually all the major public and private payers providing access to this therapy for those patients that today are costing them an awful lot of
All
money.
right, Mr. Cummings, I have to believe it. It is so revolutionary that this could give hope. I don't want to create false hopes. But why wouldn't this device also be good for Alzheimer's?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because if we're fortunate enough to get approval in depression, obviously it gives us a franchise in a very large market, that being depression, $60 billion if you look at our average selling price relative to the number of patients. It will also spur growth in epilepsy for the reasons I mentioned. And the other thing that it's going to enable us to do is to accelerate the development of the other patent-protected new indications that we currently have in the long-term phase of their respective pilot studies. And that does include Alzheimer's disease, chronic headache, and anxiety. The basis for those studies was the same basis for the depression studies. We saw preliminary suggestive evidence from commercial and study use in epilepsy and depression, and we saw some very encouraging mechanism of action, specifically neuroimaging findings that would suggest that VNS just might, at some point in the future, prove to be effective for those other inadequately treated.
Would this, I mean, you're talking about anxieties and different obsessions, I guess, would qualify. Would this have any possible potential application for drug abuse, for alcohol addiction?
Well, what's interesting is if you look at our intellectual property portfolio, it gives Cyberonics the exclusive right to manufacture or sell in the U.S. a product that applies a pulsed electrical signal to the vagus and the 2 other very important cranial nerves that have major implications in brain function. Well, in essence, that gives us the less invasive cranial nerve highway franchise for the treatment of almost any disorder you can imagine. Addictions, etc., are a couple of those disorders. And again, when you look at some neuroimaging studies that we've done, it would suggest that we are modulating blood flow in that part of the brain that is responsible for addictions.
To me, it sounds like I understand why a stock could double, because this is something that a lot of people thought would never happen, as you said, binary. But more importantly, if it works for one, it could work for all.
I just think this is such a key area, and so I'm rooting for you unabashedly. I don't own the stock, I don't know enough about financials, whatever. I just think the medical applications of this are a wonderful service. Thank you.
How about the
Thank you
FDA,
for coming on.
Larry? How about the FDA showing
Give them
some
some
integrity
They went
against
against
a lot of
the
companies?
scientific board of advisors, many of whom are funded by the big pharmas, but then again, the big pharmas have a life too. Anyway, thank you very much, all the best. Next up on KNC, we have House member and Ways and Means Chairman Bill Thomas. He's going to talk about the new corporate tax bill, that is, tax cut bill. And then later